Hello everyone, and depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our webinar, Driving Consistent, Repeatable and Scalable Demand Marketing Globally, a Demand Center Approach. My name is Andrew Freeman. I'm CEO of CRMT, and I'll be your host for this webinar. For those of you who don't know CRMT, we are a hybrid marketing consultancy and agency specializing in helping our customers with both the global, or what we call the global enablement of their marketing organization. So things like process, technology, and infrastructure, and then the smart engagement of their prospects and customers, including campaign and program creation. So making the best use of that infrastructure, really. I'd like to extend a warm welcome as well to our guest speakers, Isabel Montesdeoca and Frans van Eck. I'll get them to introduce themselves a little bit when they start their sessions a bit later. We're hoping to have at least 10 minutes, I guess, for questions at the end. So if you do think of questions, please do type them in to the GoToWebinar control panel that you should have on your screens during the presentations. And we'll try and answer as many as possible at the end. If we do have any left over, we'll make sure we follow up with you after the webinar with the answers. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand over to Isabel, who's going to introduce us to the concept of building a demand center. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to join you and Frans today to talk about demand centers, which is a topic that I love, and it's because as a service director for the demand marketing service here at Serious Decisions, I spend a lot of time working with clients that are trying to find ways to scale their demand marketing efforts and deliver that consistent performance that we all want to give, but without breaking the bank of the budget or the back of their teams due to the workload that sometimes can drive. Serious Decisions, for those of you who haven't heard of us, we basically help marketing leaders specifically on this topic to help them design, implement organizational structures, processes, and programs that can really help them achieve that goal. And often when we start this conversation and we start mentioning demand centers, what we realize is there's actually a lot of confusion out there about what we mean. So I thought for our conversation today, the right place for us to start is actually by defining what is a demand center. Let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. If we start with what it is, you should really be thinking about a demand center as a shared service. That's what it is in the first instance. Over time, it can absolutely and should have a goal of evolving to a best practice center for excellence. But usually in the starting points, it is a shared service. And it can be global, it can be regional. We'll talk a little more about that as we go forward. And at its heart, it is all about better leveraging common assets, skills, or tools so that everyone in the organization benefits and progresses at the same rate. What is it not? Well, it isn't, and you may laugh at this, but I've heard this said, what it isn't is a sweatshop that sits sort of tucked away in the back corner or a basement, producing programs, day after day, week after week. It's also not, sort of this monolithic big black box that is producing things from corporate that are disconnected from the needs of the field marketer. Really, it's supposed to be a strategically designed center that is aiming to support whatever needs the organization has, whatever gaps they have, equally from a corporate perspective and from a regional perspective. So that's a little bit about what that is, but let's talk about how if you're going to design it based on the gaps that you have, how do you actually start thinking about what those gaps might be? Well, usually we start by having a discussion internally around what are the most common business pain points that we're seeing. And usually there's no shortage of folks raising their hand going, oh my gosh, this is a problem. So let me take just a couple of these and show you how they might be really good signs for you that it's time to consider a demand center. If I look at something like bottom right-hand side, limited access to technology resources, that might be that it's not something that maybe you can afford in lots of different regions, or maybe some regions have invested in it before others. For instance, some type of marketing automation platform or a workflow platform. If I couple that with another one, which is the first one, which is lack of affordable marketing skills or even lack of talent in certain regions, again, those two things combined can mean that some regions are speeding ahead in terms of their demand goals and other regions are perhaps falling behind. A demand center is aimed at trying to make sure that by leveraging things like technology or scarce skills at the center and using that to help all of the regions benefit, that way the rising tide floats all boats and those skills are being shared equally with all marketers. If I take two other ones, let's talk about best practice sharing. So maybe there's not enough of that going on, or maybe you're seeing some duplication of effort. Again, typically, right, we would look for a demand center to be able to make everyone aware of what some of those best practices are. And I've never met a marketer that is going to reinvent the wheel just for the sake of reinventing it. If they certainly knew and were able to see what someone else was doing that was yielding great results, they would jump at it. And that's really one of the ways that the demand center can help an organization scale their demand practices. But ultimately, whatever your pain points might be, you're going to be looking for a demand center that is going to drive these 5 specific business drivers or benefits. The first one is, right, you want to be able to drive better leverage of your program investment. None of us has infinite dollars. And so wherever we can do something once and leverage it many times, that's the kind of thing we want to think about the demand center helping us do. Second, it could be addressing a changing skill or requirement. As I mentioned just a moment ago, no region left behind. It doesn't matter whether you have or you don't have the skills. We have the ability through a demand center to have those skills in one place and then share that wealth and benefit across all field marketers. The third one is around the demand waterfall performance, and that just means how you're managing your leads and how successful they are at getting through that marketing and sales funnel. What you want is a consistent and sustained focus on how that's happening and how you're helping drive business objectives through that. Too often in marketing, we're a little too focused on activity, not enough focus on some of those end results in terms of pipeline, business objectives, moving elements. So that's really what a demand center can bring, some consistency and discipline to that. The fourth one is around enhancing your buyer and customer experiences. It's not all just about internal focus, but quite often marketers don't always have the tool set or the time to ensure that they're able to develop the insights into buyers and customers that they would really want to have to make sure that their programs are going to be targeting them in the best and most efficient, engaging way possible. Again, a demand center can help make that happen so that for personas or buyers that are shared, that information can be made available to everyone. And then last but not least, getting to the point where marketing has a seat at the table. So elevating that visibility and accountability of the marketing contribution is another key element that we can look to a demand center to help us provide. So now that we've talked about what a demand center is, and typically that strategic mission that it's helping or hoping to fill, now let's talk about what forms it can take. We tend to look at them in 4 different ways. So the first, starting at the top left-hand corner, is a virtual demand center. And so what that means is it typically starts with one strong function. In this case, the example here is a marketing operations function that is has that skill set, and typically maybe it's a technology skill set. It certainly happened quite a lot with marketing automation platforms, and they've just gotten to the point where they have dealt very much with that technology and that understanding, that reporting, the analytics, and so they have that set of expertise, and we start tapping into them to be able to share that expertise and help everyone else in the marketing group basically come up to speed with those areas. And in that way, you can have one function sort of taking on that virtual demand center role. Typically, when it gets big enough, I would suggest it starts to become, a cross-functional demand committee, making sure that marketing operations is not operating in that way on its own, but pulling in some of the other key functions from the field, maybe from content and from digital as well. But that certainly is a very prevalent model in some smaller organizations. As we get bigger organizations, that's when we start looking at these two green boxes. On the top right-hand side and clockwise, it could have a global demand center, or on the bottom left, a regional demand center, which effectively is looking at formalizing that team, bringing in some key services and making those services available either to all markets, hence the global demand center, or to a specific region within the business. And then last but not least, in the blue, global and regional, this is for the much larger organizations typically, where you have quite a lot of ability to centralize and leverage different programs across the piece, but you absolutely have a significant need for localization and customization as well. And in that sense, typically you need to have those elements closer to the region to make sure that they're on target. So that's when we see a combination of the two. Now, whenever we're creating sort of this new function, however, going around the teams that currently exist, first question from them is, okay, but where is it going to sit? And is it sort of taking over my part of the world, or how does it affect me in my job? So to help with those conversations, we typically use a diagram that looks like this. Now, this is called an ecosystem picture, and it's not meant to be an organizational chart. It helps the conversation move away from who's the manager, who's the senior manager, right? How many people and how many places. Here we're specifically looking at functions, right? And trying to understand between all these different functions and how they work together is how we will end up with programs, right? And approaches that we need in order to be able to engage our prospects and our customers in a meaningful way. So you can see from this picture in green that the demand center really sits at the heart of the ecosystem, and it has a very important role to play in driving and supporting the workflow through the business. So from an upstream perspective, it has to work incredibly well with the portfolio marketing team and the global campaigns team to be able to understand and influence the solutions approach and the overall needs-based, buyer needs-based themes that we want to be using that can be leveraged by all of the different markets around the world. Now, as we look at what those solution approaches and those themes are, it's the global demand center's role to take those and then turn them into programs and program designs that can easily be executed across the different marketplaces. So upstream, very, very important. Downstream to the different field marketing teams, also critical. For them to be able to work effectively, it means having to have a relationship where they understand and can represent the voice for the field marketing teams in terms of which programs are going to be relevant and successful. There has to be coordination and planning, which means the Global Demand Center must work with the field marketers to support their local plans. So as the field marketers stand up once a year and talk about what they're going to be doing, the Global Demand Center should be there supporting them and enabling them to do so. And then last but not least, if we look to the top row, there are some key players here that the Global Demand Center would need to reach out to in order to be able to deliver on some of these items, programs, assets, different analytics and reporting. And that is the communications team, so content operations, as well as events perhaps, and the markups team. So very much, right, it's in the center, it's in the heart of everything that has to happen, and that means it has to have great relationships with all of those around it. Now, if you are considering running a demand center or thinking, hey, you know what, I actually have a lot of those problems, maybe this could be the answer for me. Well, then I would say fantastic. It's great to hear that you're thinking about it. But as always, you need to proceed with caution. And there's sort of a very methodical approach that certainly I would recommend as you start thinking about this. Because of the demand center's central place within the ecosystem we just looked at, it is very important that before you start going off and designing something on your own, that we start with a look at determining what we think the demand center strategy should be. So back to those pain points that we talked about a few slides ago. And that should be done in a very cross-functional way with senior leadership involved, so that the pain points that you're identifying are linked to real business pain and objectives all up. Then we get to the next sort of more detailed level analysis in terms of, let's take a hard look at the demand creation activities. How are we approaching them across all the different regions? How are we staffing it? What's it costing us? So that, again, we can identify very real pain points and opportunities for leverage and scale. And once we've identified those two things, we have to then go around to the different executives and those different functions that I showed on the previous picture and get that organizational buy-in. This is going to be a new team. It's going to sit at the heart of the ecosystem. So everybody has to be invested in understanding how it's going to make their lives better. And once we're able to get that agreement and adjustment, that's when we should be able to say, okay, we are all systems go. Now let's start talking about how do we actually build this demand center. And as we look at that implementation piece, I mean, there's a multi-stage process around the right model, around the services, the roles and responsibilities, and ultimately allocating resources and understanding how we would choose to roll this out in a piloted and controlled version. Now, for helping folks who are, getting to that side of things, people who already have that organizational buy-in, in our conversations, we usually try and help people along so they're not just looking at a blank piece of paper. There's nothing scarier than looking at a blank piece of paper and thinking you have to design an organization or a team from that. But we tend to, from all of the demand services that we have supported and helped develop, we tend to think about them as having typically 5 different service areas. Now, does a demand center need to have all of these? Absolutely not. But this is sort of if you like, it can be a starting point or a checklist or even a discussion guide that an organization can use across those different functions to determine, which of these map best to those pain points. So it could be on the demand program services side, which is very much about, hey, we need to be building programs that are repeatable, program plays that the field marketing teams can actually leverage and select from. Or maybe it's under digital services. We need to be helping the organization with the digital end of digital tactics. It could be on SEM, it could be on SEO and the web, or it could even be on templates that are repeatable and used by the different regions. So again, no one's reinventing the wheel. It could be over on the teleservices side, if those are something that report into the marketing, or it could be on data services and infrastructure. Data being everything around ensuring that we have the right kind of contact data in order to be targeting our audiences, segmenting, sub-segmenting, making sure we've got all the right profiles and all the right opt-ins, and then infrastructure in terms of what we need in order to drive effective demand creation, lead management, and even analysis of the results. Because ultimately we have to remember the demand center has to be helping us with that business objective of driving more revenue. And when we kind of go through this process and think about what we may or may not need from this set of 5, the next step really is to think about the fact that it's not going to be one size fits all. And if I was going to share a golden rule with you for demand centers, what I would say is that the demand center's mission is to help everyone and slow no one down. And that means that we have to take into account that some marketing teams are a little more experienced, and so we can't stand in their way. We have to help them go faster. Some marketing teams are going to be a little less experienced. There we have to help them gain more skills and also start to move faster. So there are 4 specific teams within that ecosystem that a demand center, after it's looked at its services, should talk to, get a feel for, and ask itself some questions about. Field marketing, definitely one of them. What's the scope of the field marketing job? Is it very events focused, or is it already very digitally focused? How much bandwidth do they have in those regions? And what's their skill set? And based on that, that team will be looking at adjusting the demand program side and the teleservices side. Similarly, campaign teams, does that exist within the organization? And if so, that will affect demand program services. The digital marketing team, is there a overall digital team, or is it just a corporate web team? Again, a scope, a maturity. And then last but not least, with regards to marketing operations, right? Again, maybe there is a global team, but how much can it support some of those regional teams may be a question you want to ask. And that will impact the data services and the infrastructure menus. So I hope that, it's been a whistle-stop tour, but I hope that that has helped you have a little bit of extra insight with regards to what a demand center is, how to think about defining the mission for it and the strategy for it, and what teams you should be, thinking about when you're trying to determine the extent of the services you are going to be providing. There is a couple of considerations. I'll leave you with some words from the wise that we've gained over the time that we've been helping people. I'll reiterate it again. Successful deployment starts with a very clear mission at the beginning, and please make sure that you have that executive support from the very beginning. Those things, if you don't start there, you will eventually need to go back there. So I can't urge you enough to make sure that that's where you start your journey on the right foot. The other one that I would pick out from this list is the third one, which is that the selection of services we've just talked about, it should be based on the audit that I mentioned, but it should also make sure that you are aiming to achieve both global scale and local relevance. It shouldn't be one-sided for the demand center. You should be supporting those upstream teams to help drive the global scale, but you absolutely need to keep that local relevance and the relationship with the field marketing teams in mind as well. Right,
Fantastic.
Andrew, back over to you.
Thank you, Isabel. That was great. So Isabel talked about some, I guess, of the structural considerations of implementing a demand center within an organization. I'd like to now dig down into just a little bit of detail, really, and talk about some of the key processes within the demand center. I'll then hand over to Frans, who'll talk through I guess his story of building and running a demand center firsthand. Okay, so again, for those of you who don't know CRMT, we've grown up with the data-driven marketing and sort of marketing automation industry. And over the past few years, as part of our service offering, we've helped quite a number of customers now design, build, and sometimes run their demand centers. And whilst every company, I guess, is different, over this time, we've learnt some of the common sort of practical challenges of building and running a demand center, and some of the best ways of ensuring ultimate success. So let me start by looking at the needs of the key stakeholders in the process, and Isabel touched on some of these earlier. From a marketing leadership or sort of CMO perspective, these are the key drivers that we've seen that accelerate the decision really to implement a demand center. The leadership team need their marketing organization to scale easily as the business grows through acquisition or organically. And typically, this means that a sort of proven structure, a set of processes and technologies are defined that support the overall go-to-market strategy, but can also adapt as business needs change. In doing so, they need to, and Isabel touched on this, need to ensure that both central and field teams are aligned, as well as obviously the local sales teams. And this is at all levels really, from strategy down to individual tactics. They also want to make sure that marketing initiatives that work well or seem to work well in one region are replicated across other regions. And certainly that best practice that is learnt is adopted consistently. Typically underlying this is a unified way of measuring success in one form or another, ultimately the contribution of marketing to the business as a whole. And then lastly, as Isabel mentioned as well, by focusing the key technical resources into a specialized team within the demand center, either globally or regionally, they can go some way to address the issues of employing a wide marketing skill set in each territory. The other key stakeholder in this journey is field marketing, sometimes overlooked, but it's important that their needs are also met in building a demand center, especially as we see that role of field marketing transitioning from what's been a largely tactical execution role to one that is much more strategic. Here are some of those needs that we've seen, particularly around those demand program services provided by the demand center. The demand center, as Isabel mentioned, cannot become a bottleneck in the process for program delivery. I think Isabel called it a black box, and certainly we've seen demand centers fail that are sort of faceless black boxes that just process repeated tactical requests. In the same way, it can't impose a great sort of administrative burden on the field marketer. They're busy people. The demand center team needs to create a collaborative relationship with the field, much more akin, I guess, to a consultative approach. And whilst the field may no longer need to have an intimate knowledge of the technologies in the marketing stack, they do need to understand, I guess, the art of the possible in terms of what that technology allows them to do. And that leads me on to that last point on this slide, in that organizations must still allow the field to innovate. They are, by definition, closest to their customer base in their local markets and to the local sales teams. So the ability for the field to brief in completely custom campaigns and programs, as long, obviously, as they fit within the strategic framework, the strategic go-to-market themes, that's important. And then whether you still involve the field to be hands-on in some aspects of digital execution or not, implementing a demand center will certainly change that field marketing role. And this change needs to be managed as part of the demand center rollout. We'd certainly recommend that you get field marketing, or at least representatives from field marketing, involved in the early stages of scoping and implementing a demand center. To address most of these issues and those of marketing leadership, it's really important that the demand center team employs quite a rigorous set of processes, underpinned as usual by tools and technologies to help them run those processes in an efficient way. And one of the core processes that we've seen a demand center certainly needs to get right is the campaign or the program production process, whether this is completely centralized or not. Typically what will happen around this process is that the demand center will publish a menu or a list or a catalog of shared services, usually containing templated campaigns and programs that the field marketer can use as the basis of a campaign brief or a program brief and to the demand center team. And then through the briefing process, this is revised into a more formal brief that is evaluated by demand center team and then ultimately scheduled for build and execution. Design and build within the demand center team follows that, typically with the exchange of assets and copy and images and etc. And then the program is built by the demand center team, tests sent back to the field, final sign off. And in practice, this becomes a bit of a, excuse me, an iterative process with, you know, your typical rounds of amends to images and copy and things like that. And then finally, the program or campaign is executed and program reporting and optimization kicks in. And then we'd recommend a formal program review at an appropriate point that then drives further insight back into both the field and the demand center team. So on paper, at least, this process sounds relatively straightforward. However, this is what it typically looks like in practice. Depending on the size of the demand center, there's usually a team of people involved that provide the core expertise in the different areas that Isabel talked about. And obviously marketing ops and telemarketing can also be involved in wider programs and campaigns. And then in the field, depending on the structure of the organization, there can obviously be different marketing managers, both at regional and country level, as well as potential, you know, local agencies involved in this process as well. So in practice, this results in lots of exchanges of scope, design, assets, copy, images, subject lines, schedules, target data, and it means lots of phone calls, emails, potentially online meetings and things like that. And I've tried to represent at least some of that on this diagram with the lines on this diagram. If you multiply that by the number of regions and countries that a demand center may be serving, you can quite well understand that this becomes a bit of a logistical challenge, to say the least. And certainly, unlike the people on this slide, maybe all those faces wouldn't be smiling in practice. So you can see really that this process is screaming out for automation. Remembering, of course, one of the needs of the field marketing is that they have an efficient and agile and timely production process. As we started to build demand centers for our clients, and in a number of cases run them on their behalf for a period of time, usually while they were gearing up their own resources, we looked at how we could use technology to automate the process ourselves to make this much more efficient. And we found that for us to do this at scale, we had to piece together a number of separate tools and technologies, including things like scheduling software, project management software, collaboration software, workflow software of some kind, form handling, that kind of thing, cloud storage, and that's just really to name just a few of them. And obviously our customers had exactly the same challenges. So about 3.5 years ago now, we embarked on creating a platform to handle this process. And our demand center platform's now been deployed by a number of our clients within their demand centers. And I wanted to highlight some of the functionality within the platform just to illustrate some of the concepts that you need to think about putting in place down at process level for that program production process if you build your own solution. As I mentioned earlier, you need a way of publishing online this services menu or catalog, together with a way of forming templated campaigns, programs, assets, and workflows, anything that may be a repeatable asset, I guess, within the demand center. You also need quite an efficient way of capturing online what could be, certainly for custom campaigns anyway, quite a complex brief from the field, either using these templates or a custom program designed and built from scratch. Ideally, to help the field, this should be a guided process. That's because field marketing, certainly in our experience, hate creating briefs. Certainly anything that adds to that administrative effort that I've talked about before is frowned upon by the field. So anything that can guide them through the process, minimize the time for them to complete this, also to a certain extent to help the field marketer think about the different channels available to them for the programs, the campaigns they're putting together. And lastly, also to minimize any of that iterative process, any ambiguities or questions back from the demand center team on the program that they're putting together. A core concept that we've seen that needs to be designed and agreed upon when setting up this process is some form of taxonomy or naming convention that's unified across all the regions. And typically this is applied to themes, campaigns, programs, tactics, assets, and it serves both as a naming convention and a hierarchy really that drives a number of things, including unified measurement, so measurement across regions and roll up to the corporate level. It also drives tracking and reporting, as well as just organizational things that you may have, such as the naming of folders and assets, campaigns and things like that within your marketing automation system and even in your downstream CRM systems. You also need some form of workflow, and workflow really that covers that briefing process, the scheduling process, and that sign-off. And ultimately a campaign calendar that supports this process and allows the field to see where they are in build, etc. And then lastly, really underpinning this, you need to have some form of project task management tools to ensure that you can work in this sort of distributed environment, collaborative environment really for design and build within the demand center, almost with a sort of just-in-time, I guess, factory type mentality or approach deployed for production. So really, I just want to summarize by saying think as well as structure and the goals of the demand center and some of the structural considerations that Isabel talked about. Also make sure you put the effort into implementing some of these concepts down at process level so that you can hit the ground running with your demand center as you roll it out. Because we found certainly in practice, once you lose the faith, let's call it that, of the field, it's very difficult to then get that back by improving processes later on. So we see this as pretty key. Okay, so I've talked about process and some considerations for the automation, certainly of that production process. I'd now like to hand over to our last presenter, Frans, who has experienced firsthand, I guess, Frans, the setting up of a demand center, and I thought it would be useful if he could talk through his story. So over to you, Frans.
Perfect, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and hi all. Yeah, my name is Frans and until recently I ran the global demand team for one of the world's leading e-learning organizations that is providing learning solutions and services in all corners of the world. And I want to briefly go over the experiences that I had with my team on the topic of the demand centers, to defining it and setting it up, and then the learnings from that. Now, we were a part of the larger marketing team, and we looked after the key campaigns, the campaign innovation, as well as the marketing operations and automation across the world. So in this, our setup is slightly different to the one that was discussed earlier, in that we had marketing operations and automation, but we also did something else. We also managed some of the more cross-global campaigns. Now, on one hand, we worked very closely with other more corporate level teams, such as the brand team, the product marketing team, channel marketing, and events teams. But on the other hand, of course, very closely with the regional field marketing teams. Now, our demand team looked after all the aspects of the campaigns, from the inception to the execution and the measurement across the various channels, looking at inbound and outbound, social media, web, and the whole automation around it. Now, why did we implement this team? And what this will reflect is actually many of the points that Isabel and Andrew highlighted earlier. Now, well, very talented, our regional field marketing team did not have the capacity to create a number of the campaigns with the required variety in the tactics to the level needed really by the business in the region. And on the corporate team side, there was often a limited alignment of their programs and initiatives with the regional teams. Now, with the limited capacity in the region, there was a constant trade-off between time spent on creating and rolling out the campaigns against then the aligning with sales and refining the campaigns, the messaging, and the tactics used. Now, as the skill levels and the experience of the regional teams would differ, especially on the marketing technology side, we would see that there was a big variety in the types of tactics used per region, mostly events. And we also saw differences in the quantity of them. Some regions had hardly any campaigns, while in others you could say that they had too many. And of course, there was also a variety in the quality of the campaigns. Now, I know it's the same in many of the other global organizations, and you'll probably have it as well. Our marketing resources have always been more than finite. So hiring more experts in each of the regions to duplicate the skill sets was really not an option. So for us, the capacity, the skill set, the user experience, and the need for the teams to align more were those key issues for us. That's when we decided to implement our global demand team, and as part of that, we also worked, of course, very closely with the CRMT team and looked into, of course, the research the series provided. Now, our objective was to ensure that we would generate the right level of demand in each of our markets, professionalize the processes, and very importantly, scale this up and ensure that our clients and prospects would get the best impression of our organization and our solutions. Now, on the implementation side, technology-wise, we leveraged a combination of Eloqua, Salesforce, Asana, and of course, CRMT services. In rolling out the process, we took a phased and a regional approach to the implementation of this global demand approach. Now, for all the regions, we developed campaign standards, the tactics, and the campaign flow. And for some of the regions, we provided a more of a hands-on approach to help with the production, whereby we would facilitate the creation of all the tactics. While for others, those where the skill set was available, we would follow a much more of a enablement approach. The initial setup phase took about 3 months, going with our biggest markets first, and then by 9 months roughly, we had rolled out the demand center to all teams. Overall feedback has been very positive, and quality and completeness of our campaigns went up very significantly. However, there are, of course, more than a couple of learning moments that we had as part of this, and I'll just highlight 4 of them as part of this call. First of all, it is key to design your processes and your communication as a collaboration process. It's been highlighted before. Isabel mentioned the pitfall of a demand center being suboptimal when it is purely a fulfillment and production team. We more sometimes had the experience in the beginning of being a team that suffered from a throw over the fence approach. Of course, this is something that doesn't work, and we changed that, of course, but it's key to focus on that because it doesn't leverage the key differentiators that you'll have of having a demand team, especially with the knowledge and the expertise in that team. And not taking care of that can lead to suboptimal results and frustrations in the team. And it could actually lead to people wanting to leave. So do take this into account. We got the best results and feedback when we made sure there was frequent communication and collaboration from the briefing phase all the way through the campaign creation, execution, and evaluation steps. There are enough tools that can help you with that, but it's very important. And collaboration, of course, does not stop with the work between demand and the regional marketing teams. The regional marketeers most often have other stakeholders such as sales, client services, and channel partners. Hence, it's key, and we made sure that the regional teams would get examples of the assets as well as easy to share metrics so they could share that with their stakeholders. Now, another learning is to be clear on the process of the demand center and what is needed to be effective and efficient. In the beginning, we had teams submit just half of the briefing, but omit the key content and key steps, mentioning that that would come later. And Andrew mentioned the field marketers often hate creating briefs, and that is what we found in the early steps as well. Now, the result was that this would hold up not only the campaign, but often resulted in more resources and more time being needed for the campaign, and in effect, other campaigns to be delayed. So we really focused on making sure that we did only start when we did receive all that information beforehand. A third learning, when it came to the inception of campaigns, you can increase the efficiency and professionalism by creating a sort of a library of best practices or template campaigns and programs that are aligned with the specific purposes in your business. These would then include a variety of the steps, the tactics, and the channels that you would want to use or want to see used. Some of our teams in their briefings just looked at the immediate tactic needs, often just a series of emails, and sometimes did not consider about the follow-ups, the connection opportunities with other campaigns, the different tactics, or the future use by channel partners. Now, by providing a set of the templates, you can instill the use of best practices and speed up the process of quality campaign and program development. Plus, it's good to look at the broader picture and include not just demand aspects, but also the awareness and the sales enablement parts, because you will need sales involved as well, of course. This way, we moved away from the heavy use of just emails to the inclusion of other items such as social media and personalized communications and follow-up, and it helped us create more holistic campaigns. As a fourth and last point, but definitely not the least important, when you have rolled out your demand center, and especially when it is in full swing, it is key that you have the right reports and insights set up to be able to effectively manage it and keep your SLAs. And the various regions and corporate teams rely on you and your work for their campaigns and demand creation. Your efforts are business critical. So we made sure we could track the initiatives in each of their stages, as well as the team and other outside resources who were working on creating the initiatives, following in what stage each campaign was, who was doing what, where they were seeing delays, and at what stage all the items were and what was coming next was key. This helped us keep the campaign production up, plus it helped us fine-tune the estimates on how much effort and impact an initiative would have to take. And that helped us for good planning for our team, but also in discussions with the regional teams. Now, we worked very closely with CRMT in this process, and they have significant experience in this. And for us, the rollout of the demand team was very important, and it has helped to improve our campaign development and scale and professionalize the demand creation as we set out to do. Now, if you're working in a similar environment where you need to balance capacity, skill sets, user experience, and growing demand for marketing, a demand center is certainly worth considering. I want to thank you for your time today, and with that, I'd like to hand it back to Andrew. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Frans. That was great. Okay, let's just look at the time. Yeah, we've got time for what looks like about a couple of questions. Let me just have a look at the questions that have come through. Isabel, this is possibly one for you. So it's a question about definition, really, of demand center. So is a demand center a replacement expansion of marketing ops, or something entirely different, i.e. a new function, an orchestration layer?
Great question. Thank you, Andrew. And I think it depends on those 4 different models that I shared on one of my early slides. So certainly there is that virtual demand center, and most frequently when I see that occur, that is a sort of an expansion of the marketing operations function. Typically where the marketing operations function is very well staffed, like I said, it has some specialist skill sets that perhaps haven't been brought up to, the rest of the organization hasn't been brought up to speed. Way back when, it used to be around things like marketing automation platform. These days it could be for some things perhaps around using AI and predictive as part of programs. So sometimes that can be the catalyst that makes us broaden out the marketing operations remit, and they start to function like more than marketing operations. They start to function like a virtual demand center. However, beyond that can only stretch so far, because that's not really the main focus of marketing operations. So, as things evolve, it will, become a new team, right? And that team will have, as we were talking about those 5 different areas, a cross-functional group of people who can bring to it the ability to create best practice programs, create best practice templates, understand how to manage data. Perhaps it could also be supporting and managing tele, and then ultimately having that ongoing analysis of performance and optimization of programs. So in the long run, as it grows, it will absolutely be a new team.
Great, thanks, Isabel. Frans, possibly one for you. I know you mentioned it in your presentation or touched on it, but can you talk about the MarTech stack that you actually deployed as part of the demand center?
Oh yes, so we used a variety of tools. Of course, our main technology that we used was Eloqua for our marketing programs, Salesforce. We used Asana for our direct project management. We used the demand center to capture from CRMT to capture a lot of the information on developing the campaigns and the best practices, as I mentioned earlier. Salesforce, of course, as well. Those were the main tools that we used.
Okay, brilliant. And Isabel, this might be similar to the last question, but it says, my company is not that big. Is a demand center applicable to me?
Again, great question. Certainly, there's a study that we did not long ago that looked at the way different size of organizations are using demand centers, and I would say that across the board, I'm seeing organizations of all sizes use some element of a shared service center. So I think the answer is yes, even if you are part of a small company, this could definitely help you. Again, which kind of model goes back to, as you said, that previous discussion on the 4 different types of demand center. So the question isn't, could it help you? I think it could. It's just a matter of finding the right model and approach for your type of organization.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more. Frans, what was your biggest challenge in getting your demand center up and running? People, technology, process?
Oh, I think in general, well, technology can always be a challenge. You never have enough resources, but I think the main thing is processes and getting everyone aligned. And I would urge everyone to really just consider the flow and really get buy-in from the wider team, also the people that will be working with you on the process of requesting campaigns, managing it, etc., and contributing. We're all very busy, and before you know it, you run into bottlenecks. I highlighted the campaign technology that we used. Now, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of technology to roll out a demand center, but one of the key things is indeed the processes. If you don't have frequent contact with the requester in the meantime of creating a campaign, going back and forth, your campaign may be less efficient. If you don't get the full campaign in the beginning, you may get into delays. And if you can't manage, if you have all the campaigns going, if you can't manage the people that are creating your campaigns, be it in-house or out-house, if you can't see what they're working on and what they have to do next, and effectively track that and manage that, then you'll have a hard time. Now, it's not rocket science, but you do have to think about it. You do have to put it together. And as in any organization, if you make too many allowances for variations, you're going to make your life a little bit more difficult than it has to be.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we can squeeze one last one in. Isabel, this might be beyond your area of expertise, but are demand centers applicable to B2C?
You know, I couldn't hazard a guess for you on that. B2C is actually not an area where I have tons of expertise. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Since we were, of course, in the organization I worked with, working on technology to consumers, in a sense, as well as to students, the short answer is yes. But you definitely need to consider how you do that, because with B2B and B2C, there's slightly different rules. But as campaigns, of course, are more tactics than just your email, and demand center often has the technological expertise that you may not have in regions. The answer could be yes, but how you set up your demand center, what kind of function, what kind of process you have within it may differ a bit. But I would say that if you have different regions and you have that skill set variation, then it's definitely worth exploring.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that takes us to the top of the hour. Sorry, we haven't managed to go through all the questions, but as promised, I will note them down and make sure we get answers back to everyone that's put questions online. Okay, just to say thank you to everyone for attending. I do hope it's been useful for you, no matter where you are on your demand center journey. Thanks again to Isabel and Frans. Do contact me if you've got any questions or would like us to help you with your demand center. Have a great rest of the day, wherever you are, and goodbye.
Thank you.